Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Dear listeners, today I have a repeat guest. With me, there's Martin Refalo. Martin, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much. I'm very keen to chat today. And yeah, thanks for asking me to be back on.
Oh, I'm very excited because the last time we spoke, for the listeners, that was episode 23. We talked about your open access systematic review and meta-analysis about the influence of proximity to failure on hypertrophy. Today, we have another study that you've recently published, and you've called it your biggest project to date. And it's again exploring the relationship between hypertrophy and proximity to failure, but in a very different way this time. So how about you give us an introduction to the study? Why did you call it your biggest project to date? And why were you inspired to design this particular study the way it is?
So yeah, you're definitely correct. I say that is my biggest project to date for good reason. It's the final project of my whole PhD. So this started about 3 years ago. I started my PhD journey, and the goal was to explore proximity to failure in resistance training. Since then, I've published, I think, 5 or so studies in this area, which I think provide important insights into helping us better understand proximity to failure and specifically how it influences muscle hypertrophy. So most of last year was dedicated to data collection for this study. I really did start planning the study about 3 years ago, probably finalized planning it at the end of 2022, and then conducted 25 weeks worth of data collection last year. So that was basically me spending 6 to 7 days, in the gym, testing these participants, putting them through these protocols, watching all the pain and suffering that these participants were going through, but also watching, how much they were learning and kind of enjoying the experience. So there was an upside for them. And, that was followed by months of statistical analysis, manuscript writing, and, all the things that really went into the design of this study. Took up so much time and effort, to learn more about so many different things. And that's why I call it my biggest project to date. It's one thing to be able to sit down on your computer and conduct a meta-analysis, right? Which is like, I could do that completely from the comfort of my own office here. But it's another thing to be in the lab, aka the gym, putting people through the protocols, collecting data, analyzing it, and making an original contribution to research. And that was my goal here, to make a contribution that I thought was novel, significant, and interesting to all the people out there who are interested in exercise science and who are interested in thinking about their training a little bit more than the average individual. So that led me to designing a study that compared RIR with failure. And this really is the first study to use RIR prescription and investigate muscle hypertrophy. So you hear this topic spoken about a lot in the industry. You hear people speak about RIR and all this apparent research looking into RIR. And we have many studies that compare failure versus non-failure training. And obviously non-failure training is to some extent RIR training because they're reaching a specific RIR. But really we don't know with high accuracy and high confidence what RIR is being reached in those non-failure conditions. Some studies we have a little bit more confidence than others in our estimations. And this was the first study to say, hey, for this protocol, you're going to stop at a certain RIR target, and it's going to be completely up to you. Set termination is going to be completely up to you, and we're going to investigate how your muscles respond to that and how that compares to terminating every set to failure. And that's what we're going to be speaking about today.
Perfect introduction. Thank you, Martin. Now, since you went into a little bit of detail explaining the difference between a meta-analysis and a study like the one that you designed, and also you've mentioned how it is novel in that it compares a specific reps in reserve target to training to failure. Could you explain for somebody who's not involved in academia how to think about a single study within a body of literature as opposed to a meta-analysis, and what may be the pros and cons of the fact that your study is novel?
That's a great question. I think I'll start off by saying that a key element of the scientific attitude is that every study finding is considered provisional. So this goes for all previous studies in this area, including meta-analyses and the current study that we're speaking about today. So this is one of the first rules that a scientist applies when they evaluate research, and people that operate in the field, practitioners, should do the same. The point of science is to get closer to the truth, but over time. And so in the meantime, you must maintain intellectual humility and embrace the uncertainty that comes along with some of the individual studies. Now, further to that, in exercise science, the results of studies, right, whether they come from an experimental study like the one I recently conducted or a meta-analysis, shouldn't verify or refute a theory. Okay, in science, we often have a theory that we put to the test, and the results of that test should tell us whether the theory is either strengthened or weakened by the given data, right? So over time, if there is a lot of evidence against the theory, we can eventually throw it out and replace it with a new one. And with all these studies being published, it's really cool to see all these studies being published. But what we need to understand is that the results of these studies need to be considered relative to the methods employed. And this is why I spend so much time speaking about methods, because we may put more stock into one study over another if the methods are deemed better. And the validity of conclusions that you read really does hinge on the design of the study, the statistical analysis, the participants studied. And again, that's why I spend most of my time focusing on methods, because over time, if we can improve methods, we can produce better knowledge, better information. So when new research comes out, you have to consider all of these factors. And this means that you shouldn't update your practical applications overnight. My concern here is that that's what some people do, whether it be information coming from research, right? So an experimental study or a meta-analysis or TikTok, they change their applications overnight. And instead, we need to tinker with our applications as new research comes out. So, we have these meta-analyses which aggregate all the research in a certain area. They're often deemed as the gold standard of research, but they come with their own limitations. And there are limitations baked into those data sets that are analyzed. We have to understand that, right? Despite it being the totality of the evidence, right? There are certain limitations that sometimes make conclusions limited. And same goes for experimental studies. In the case of experimental studies, we have a specific research question that provides us with a specific answer, and we can't apply that answer directly in practice. There are so many other things that need to be considered when we're speaking about practical applications that I'd like to speak about later. And for now, it's important that you, as an individual who might coach others, or as a trainee who's interested in science, you need to have these tools to better think about research and information and evaluate it or else you might be led astray over time. And that's where I find my job kind of mostly operating, is helping people better think about research. Because at the end of the day, I have an opinion, but there are many other people out there who also have opinions, who are well respected, and their opinions might be well informed and well thought over. And individuals out there will be listening to many different people and possibly many opinions. They need to have the tools to evaluate all that and decide what they should be doing on their own.
Thank you, Martin. Now let's get into the study. And since you mentioned the methods, can you start by talking us through the study design then?
For sure. So this was what we call a within subject design. Now, there are basically two ways in exercise science we can conduct research. Really simplifying this, but you can think of there as being within subject designs and between subject designs. So if we were doing a between subject design, I would be comparing me to you, right? So I would be completing a certain protocol, you would be completing another protocol, and we'd be comparing the two between us. Now, with the within subject design, we compare limb to limb within the same participant. So in the case of my study, I compared individuals' left limbs to their right limbs, right? So not comparing now individual to individual, but left leg to right leg within the same person. Now, this is a very robust study design when looking at muscle hypertrophy, because it takes care of some factors that you simply can't control for with a between subject design. So with a between subject design, we can't control for the difference in genetics between individuals, right? Definitely can't control for that. We might be able to control for sleep, but that's pretty hard. You have to tell people to sleep a certain amount of hours, but then you can't control for their sleep quality. We know how important sleep is for physiological adaptation. Nutrition is another one you might be able to control, but that's easier said than done. Stress levels, you basically can't control. Whereas within subject design takes care of that, because I'm comparing my left to my right leg, takes care of all those factors. Now, some people might say, well, when you train one leg or one side of the body, you induce a hormonal response, and that hormonal response might influence the adaptations that the contralateral limb experiences. Now, in the case of muscle hypertrophy, there seems to be little to no crossover from one limb to the other. Okay, so this is often known as a cross-education effect. Systemic hormone concentration doesn't seem to be correlated with hypertrophy, right? And when we have these studies that do train one limb but don't train the other, hypertrophy is hardly ever experienced in that immobilized limb. If we were investigating strength outcomes, though, the conclusions would be a bit different. So neural drive and neuromuscular adaptations, they seem to be crossed over from one limb to another, but hypertrophy doesn't. So again, it's a very strong study design. Now, what I did is I recruited 18 individuals, and I randomly assigned both of their legs to a specific protocol. So one leg was assigned to the failure protocol, the other leg was assigned to the RIR protocol. The protocol consisted of the leg press and the leg extension, obviously the unilateral variation of the two. The leg press was performed to 8 to 10 reps on average, right? In between that range, leg extension was 10 to 12. The rest periods were 4 minutes in between sets on the leg extension, 4 minutes between sets on the leg press, 2 minutes on the leg extension. And the only thing that differed between the protocols was the proximity to failure, right? So the failure leg performed all sets to momentary muscular failure. The RIR leg performed the leg press to 2 RIR, the leg extension to 1 RIR. Okay, and these sessions that I'm describing here, they've conducted twice per week for 8 weeks. And that allowed us to investigate hypertrophy with an ultrasound assessment. So basically what that entails is assessing the thickness of certain muscles. I decided to measure the vastus lateralis and the rectus femoris to give us an estimation of total quadriceps hypertrophy.
That makes sense. Thank you. I was wondering, when it comes to rating the RIR, that is subjective. So
Mm-hmm.
how did you attempt to overcome this potential limitation that it's not an objective measure?
Yeah. So I don't think this is something you can necessarily overcome, but you can understand the limitations that RIR comes with, and you can try and limit them. So,
Mm-hmm.
firstly, RIR itself is objective. It's not subjective. We have an RIR scale, okay? We
Mm-hmm.
have numbers. They're objective numbers. Now, what happens to be subjective is the prediction of RIR.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, that's what my participants had to do. Now, there really is only one way to precisely estimate, not even estimate, to precisely calculate, right,
Mm-hmm.
how accurate someone's RIR predictions are. And that is to put them through a set to failure on a given exercise and get them to call out when they believe they've reached a certain RIR target, but
Mm-hmm.
then they continue performing repetitions to failure.
Mm-hmm.
So that test I just outlined, I actually conducted prior to the start of the intervention. So I
Mm-hmm.
put all the participants through a repetitions to failure assessment. That's what I called it, on both the leg press and the leg extension. They had to predict a 1 or a 3 RIR on
Mm-hmm.
two separate sets. And what I found was that on average, right, participants were within 1 rep of the RIR target that was prescribed. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's quite promising. It's in line with some previous research we have. And it's important to understand that this sample of participants were highly trained.
Mm-hmm.
That this was the highest reported training experience of all the studies in this relevant literature that compare failure versus non-failure training or different
Mm-hmm.
velocity loss thresholds. All my participants had experience predicting RIR or RPE. So I chose a sample that was conducive to the design of the study, which employed RIR prescription. That's really important to understand because you can't
Mm-hmm.
take that and then apply it to all the demographics that exist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this finding is specific to the demographic that I studied, and on average, my participants had about 7 years of training experience.
Mm.
So, although throughout the intervention, right, I don't know how accurate participants were when predicting their RIR in that RIR protocol,
Mm-hmm.
I can at least be a little confident, a little more confident than I otherwise would if I didn't do the RIR accuracy assessment, that participants predicted their RIR close to the targets that I prescribed. And that's all reported in the paper for the readers to see. And that hasn't been, that was the first time an RIR accuracy assessment had been conducted before the start of an intervention. And I think it's something that researchers can do going forward if they want to employ RIR prescription.
Brilliant. I agree that that would be excellent. And I was wondering, the last time you were on the podcast, we spent some time discussing how in research, training the term failure has been
Mhm.
used before. So when you say that the group training to failure achieved failure, would what I'm saying
Mm.
failure 25 times, but the
Yeah,
point
yeah, yeah.
is, what
I say
was
it
failure
every
in your
day.
study?
A failure in my study was defined as per my scoping review from 2022.
Mm-hmm.
So, momentary muscular failure is the point throughout a repetition where you are no longer able to complete the concentric portion with a full range of motion
Mm-hmm.
despite attempting to do so. Now, in
Mm-hmm.
practice, there's different ways you can define failure in
Mm-hmm.
practice, right? There's technical failure. Certain exercises might be conducive to one definition of failure over another. You might fail in the lengthened position, but not the shortened position. There's lots of nuances that are relevant to practice. In research, we often have to draw a line, right? And we have to say this is how we're going to define a certain idea, a certain concept, a certain term, and we're going to have to stick with it despite some of the limitations that it might have in practice.
Mhm.
So in research, you need to have an objective and involuntary point of set termination if you're using the term failure, because that's what people often think when they hear the term
Mhm.
failure. So you don't have to use that definition, but that's what people think. So
Yeah.
there are some studies out there, for example, that employ the definition of volitional failure, which means participants stop when they believe they've reached failure.
Mhm.
But if you spent some time on the gym floor, you'll know that some people will think they've reached failure when they really haven't.
Mhm.
So someone who reads that paper, right, might assume that momentary muscular failure was reached when in fact it wasn't.
Mhm.
So with all that said, I employed that definition, and what that meant was participants didn't choose when to stop their sets on the failure leg. They kept performing repetitions until on the leg press, the weight came crashing down, or on the leg extension, they just couldn't reach the range of motion that was allocated.
Mm. Perfect. Now, can you tell us a bit more about the participants? You've already explained that they had a lot of training experience, about 7 years. So I'm wondering, training experience doing what? Meaning, how many
Mhm.
times per week were they training? Were they training specifically for hypertrophy? And also, can you clarify for the listeners why it is important to talk about what kind of participants you recruited for the study?
For sure. Well, in my meta analysis that we
Mm-hmm.
spoke about last time I was on,
Yes.
I I retrieved 5 studies off the top of my head that compared training to momentary muscular failure versus non-failure training.
Mm-hmm.
Now, only one of those 5 studies was conducted in resistance trained individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that obviously doesn't sound like much, but there are other studies in resistance trained individuals. For example, all the velocity loss studies in that meta analysis were conducted on a trained demographic. But all I'm trying to say here is that we can't just read the conclusion of a study and apply it across all demographics, as I've already alluded to. We
Mm-hmm.
need to look at some of these finer details because the response might differ across certain demographics of individuals. In this case, the demographic was a trained population. Like I said, they had 7 years on average of training experience.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing resistance training on average 4 to 5 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they all had experience predicting RIR and training to failure, and they also all had experience working with a trainer in a face-to-face setting. So this just exemplifies the competency that these participants came to the study
Mm-hmm.
with. Um, so when we look at this data and we read the conclusions, if we're assuming the population is normally distributed and we're working as a practitioner, we're working with someone who does fit this rough criteria, right? We can assume that the results of this study are going to apply to that individual to some extent, right? Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
with some level of uncertainty. And that's why, I um, went into quite some depth reporting the participant characteristics within the study, along with their nutritional intake over the 8-week period to
Mm-hmm.
really highlight what this sample of participants looked like and how they were eating across the 8-week period, because we obviously know that is going to play some sort of a role in influencing muscle hypertrophy as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, I was going to ask you about their nutritional status. How did you control for that? What was the aim of the intervention from a nutritional standpoint?
Yeah. So because of the within subject design, there is already some level of control for
Mm-hmm.
nutrition
Mm-hmm.
because we're comparing leg to leg within the same person who eats obviously a certain amount of food per day, and it's to some extent controlled for.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean we had a sample of 18 participants, right? That doesn't mean that some participants could be eating in a calorie surplus and others possibly a calorie deficit. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did is we took it one step further and we said participants in this study have to be eating in a calorie surplus, right? The goal was to gain 1% of their body weight per month, and we used the Macro Factor app to monitor their nutrition and to ensure that participants were able to track their food intake and eat, sufficiently to build muscle. So what does that look like? Well, the first step is a calorie surplus. Second step is eating a certain amount of protein, and then macro factor basically did the rest of their macronutrient prescriptions. So over the 10-week period, because nutrition was investigated over 10 weeks, because we have 1 week of testing, 8 weeks of training, and another week of post testing, the participants gained about 3% of their body weight over that time period, about 3.5%, which, if you think about it, is pretty close to 1% per month.
Mm-hmm.
The average protein intake for males was about 200 grams, for females about 145 grams. And if you look at their kind of starting body weight, that's about double their body weight in
Mm-hmm.
kilos in protein. So again, that provides more confidence in these findings because individuals were eating sufficiently to build muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, you might read through an exercise science, paper, resistance training paper, and you won't see these nutrition variables reported. And so, some of those factors that pertain to differences in nutrition between individuals might be present in that type of a study. It is hard to get participants to do this. So I kind of understand where researchers are coming from sometimes when they say that controlling for nutrition is difficult and is easier said than done. Again, because I had quite a highly trained demographic of individuals who had, probably off the top of my head, probably all of them had tracked their nutrition in the past, is quite an easy sell, and I didn't really have too many issues throughout that 10-week period gathering the data I needed to report in the paper.
That makes sense. Thanks for explaining. Now, you've talked about what kind of exercises you employed in the training program. Now, I was wondering, outside of the two exercises that you were studying, what kind of training, if any, did the
Mm.
participants do?
So, Nikias, if I told you to sign up to my study and and the study involved, a leg training protocol, but you weren't allowed to do anything else besides the leg training protocol in my study for 10 weeks, how would you feel about that?
I would probably tell you, unless you pay me a lot of money,
Yeah.
that ain't happening.
So you'd probably say no, right? And I probably wouldn't recruit any participants. So the good thing is when you train your quadriceps, there are a limited number of muscles that I'll rephrase that. When you train your quadriceps, there are a limited number of other exercises, non-quad based exercises, that are
Hmm.
likely going to stimulate growth in your quadriceps.
Yes.
So let's contrast that to the biceps, for example. Obviously, we have exercises that directly target the biceps, but when you train your back, whether you're doing a row or a pull down, you're likely distributing some tension to your biceps, which will influence hypertrophy in that area. So, if I was to run a study that looked at biceps hypertrophy, I'd have to control for all the participants' back training, which would be very difficult to do, right? In the case of the quadriceps, we have a set of exercises that directly target the quadriceps. When you train your hamstrings, you train your quads, not so much. Maybe in a deadlift you do. So the individuals weren't able to do deadlifts for that reason, but they could do hamstring curls and other,
Mm.
hamstring isolation exercises. When you train your glutes, maybe you get some quads as well, depending on how you set yourself up. So individuals weren't able to do full range of motion hip thrusts, just
Mm.
constant tension, short range of motion hip thrust.
Hmm.
And again, they weren't able to do like sumo deadlifts and other deadlift variations that might work the glutes. So
Mm.
they were limited in some regards, but they were able to perform their own training program outside of the training intervention that they completed with me.
Perfect. That makes sense. And now, in terms of the volume that you employed for the intervention, what was that like?
Okay, so this is a good question. I think this is an important point because again, I'll use the example of you signing up to my study. So let's just say you
Mm-hmm.
said yes, you signed up to my study, and maybe you were doing 20 sets for your quads in your previous training program. Right? You
Mm-hmm.
just love training quads, so you did 20 sets, which would be crazy, but some people do it. Some people get good results doing it. If I assigned every participant in my study to 10 sets, right,
Mm-hmm.
for their quads, and you came into this study, you would be going from 20 to 10. So you'd be halving your set volume. Now, we might have another participant in the group who is used to doing maybe 5 sets for their quads, right, because they don't like training quads. And
Mm-hmm.
they come into the study, they go from 5 to 10. That's doubling their volume.
Yes.
So you have to consider previous training volume to some extent, and yes, a within subject design kind of takes care of that. But what takes that potential limitation one step further is personalizing the volume of the individuals. And again, if it's a within subject design, there's no issues doing that because if I do 10 sets, if I've been doing 10 sets and I continue doing 10 sets, well, both of my legs are going to be doing it. And if you've been doing, let's say, 13 sets and you come into the study and you continue doing 13 sets, even though that's 3 more sets than me, both of your
Mm-hmm.
legs are exposed to that. And you should have a pretty consistent rate of progress for your quads compared to what you've been experiencing
Mm-hmm.
because the set volume is roughly the same. Halfway through the intervention, set volume increased by 20%. That was on average maybe 1 to 2, sometimes 3 extra sets across the whole week. And if participants came into the study doing over 15 sets for their quads, what we did was we reduced the volume by 20%. That was a pragmatic decision to reduce the participants' overall burden,
Mm-hmm.
reduce the duration of the training protocols, and to hopefully reduce injury risk. Because what you have to consider here, Nikias, is that individuals signed up for this study, and from day one, it was 100% effort, right? 100% mental effort. Whether they
Mm-hmm.
were terminating their sets at failure or at RIR, it was 100% of their psychological effort. And that's where the term effort kind of gets confused. Sometimes people say maximal effort is reaching failure, but I
Mm-hmm.
could say that someone gave maximal psychological effort and just stopped 2 reps shy
Mm-hmm.
from failure. And that comes with a cost. It's like you do that twice a week for 10 weeks with no auto regulation, no breaks, just full throttle. And there is potential for pains to arise, for injuries possibly as well. So I reported the number of musculoskeletal complaints that I received in the paper. So for the failure leg, it was about 5. RIR, it was about 3. But we did have what I called an injury in the
Mm-hmm.
RIR leg. Um, I called it an injury because the participant had to stop, and then we resumed or we restarted the intervention months later when she recovered. Um, but the rest of the complaints were just pains that individuals felt, and they were able to continue the intervention.
That makes sense. When you say that you assign them to start with the volume that they were used to, what I think about is I wonder if they were also used to reaching the same RIR target or failure with that volume, because that would obviously affect how the volume, how the volume um,
How
what kind of
potent
stimulus
the
they get.
volume
Yeah,
is.
how potent the volume is exactly. The response to that volume.
Mhm.
That's what would be affected.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm not sure how we would really go about gauging that prior to the study. Obviously, some people track their RIRs,
Hmm.
um, others don't. And what we also have to consider here is if you were to sign up to my study, Nikias, I dare say you'd be pretty damn motivated for those 10 weeks because you're going to be like, I've signed up for this. I'm putting myself through this pain. I'm just going to give it 100% and try
Yes.
and get the most out of it. So, a function of that would
Mhm.
probably be a higher, just general training intensity,
Mhm.
right? More psychological effort put into each of your sets.
Mhm.
And that might actually get you some pretty good results.
Yeah.
And we found that every participant in the study grew some muscle, despite the sample of participants being highly trained.
Mhm. Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask. I brought up that thought. I believe that I don't know if this is the term used in literature, if there is one, but I heard Steve Hall call it the lab effect.
The lab effect, I like it.
Yeah, that's why I use it too now. I was like, yeah, that's pretty good. Anyway, so my next question would be, what was the average set volume then that you used across the study?
Yeah, the average set volume calculated from the additional 20%,
Mm-hmm.
right, that we added halfway through the study
Mm-hmm.
was 12 for males and 14 for females. Now,
Mm.
I have the means, the averages reported in the paper, but I also have the range to provide more context. For males, that range was 10 to 14 sets. For females, it was 12 to 17, so
Mm-hmm.
slightly higher. So you can think of the results of my study holding across that range of sets. So anywhere between 10 to 17 sets across the week for your quads. Obviously, we divided that in two because we had two sessions, and then we
Mm-hmm.
tried to spread it evenly across the two exercises.
Mm. That makes sense. And why did you choose to distribute the volume equally between the two exercises?
I've never been asked that, and I think it's just the first thought that comes to my head is to evenly distribute the volume.
Mm-hmm.
People often ask me, why I chose the leg press and the leg extension, and why I chose the rep ranges. And in most cases, they were very pragmatic decisions. Right?
Mm.
These are practical exercises that people perform quite commonly. I had access to the equipment. They're stable exercises which can be pushed close to failure.
Mm-hmm.
The rep ranges don't come with a high level of discomfort. They're
Mm-hmm.
rep ranges that people often perform and are used to
Mm-hmm.
performing, and they're obviously sufficient to promote hypertrophy. And the same goes for distributing, the sets evenly across the muscles.
Mm.
It's really just a pragmatic decision. I didn't really think about it any further than that.
That makes sense. I was going to ask you about the rep ranges used, so it's good that you
Yeah,
covered that
yeah,
as
yeah.
well. I only asked because in my experience, not every set provides the same stimulus.
Mhm.
So so then as a result, if you do 5 sets of leg extensions and 5 sets of leg press, that
Mm,
might yield slightly different
mm.
stimuli than if you did 8 sets of leg press versus 2 sets of leg extensions. Somebody would probably die
Yeah,
in that protocol.
yeah, yeah.
So.
So that's sorry to jump in, but that's exactly like one of the reasons why I just kept it the same across the legs. And
Mhm.
thinking about it a little bit further, considering we know that it is possible to experience muscle specific hypertrophy, some
Mhm.
exercises target some musculature more so than others.
Mhm.
Again, it just makes sense to keep it even across the two.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. So my final question on volume is why the 20% increase halfway through?
So previous studies have employed that approach, and they found it to be a reliable way. So individualizing set volume and then adding 20% halfway through has been found to
Mhm.
be a reliable way of investigating, hypertrophy across a sample of participants. So I used the methods that had been employed in the past. And it really is just a way of taking that stimulus a little bit further once participants have become accustomed and acclimatized to the training. It reduces injury risk. If we had, I think it reduces injury risk. I don't think I have hard data to show that, but if participants went straight from their previous training volume to a 20% increase, that
Mhm.
acute increase in workload might influence injury risk. So I thought to be conservative, add that 20% halfway through, add an additional stimulus to resistant training demographic, so they might benefit from that.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but then I get the impression that you were thinking to increase the volume to encourage hypertrophy to occur, taking into account that the participants were highly trained.
Correct, yeah.
That makes sense. So with that, I believe we've covered the methods and the study design in quite a lot of depth. Do you think that we missed out on anything, or are you ready to move on to outcomes and results?
Ready to move on to outcomes.
Okay, let's go. What did you find?
So, firstly, I think it's important to summarize how we analyzed the data.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because like I said, the conclusions you read in a paper
Mm-hmm.
hinge on the statistical methods employed and all the other
Mm-hmm.
things that we've already spoken about. So, Nikias, you're probably familiarized with the standard approach to statistical testing, which is to identify whether or not a statistical difference exists, right? A
Mm-hmm.
statistically significant difference exists between two groups. And
Yes.
a lot of people will resonate with those terms. They would have heard the term statistical significance or p values. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing here is we are setting a certain threshold, right? And if we don't get to that threshold point, we can't say that a difference exists between the protocols, even though you
Mm-hmm.
might see a mean difference, right? The average result of one group might be a little higher than the average result of the other. We can't say that there is a statistically significant difference between the groups with that traditional statistical testing method, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of this study, we use what is known as a Bayesian approach to statistical analysis, where we estimated the size of an effect, so the effect being the result. Okay, we're estimating the size of that effect. We are estimating how probable that effect is, right? What is the likelihood of observing that effect, and the uncertainty of that effect, right? And if you look through the paper, you'll notice probability distributions in the results section,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you look at that probability distribution, you can see, right, the effect that has the highest probability, right, or the mean, which sits somewhere in the middle. You can see the uncertainty, so the width of that distribution, and you can make comparisons. You can make visual and intuitive comparisons between the probability distributions for each of the protocols. Now, this goes for the change in muscle thickness. Let's start there. When you look at those probability distributions, you see that the probability of experiencing a certain change in muscle thickness, right, from pre to post training, is quite similar between the fail and RIR protocols.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and again, we're stepping away from the previous thought process of looking at p values and statistical significance. We're just making a comparison. And as a practitioner or somebody who's interested in these things, you can easily make interpretations from the graphics that are shown there in the results section.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, the next step is comparing the fail and RIR protocols, directly comparing them. And there is a probability distribution in the paper which shows that comparison. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the probability of the results either favoring fail or RIR are pretty equal, right? They're
Mm.
equal. So in that probability distribution, the amount of color that represents each of the protocols is roughly even on both sides of the zero, which is right in the middle there. And what we can say is that similar quadriceps hypertrophy was observed, right, between the protocols across the intervention period. Now, quadriceps hypertrophy, what is that? Well, that's coming from our measures of rectus femoris muscle thickness and vastus lateralis muscle thickness. Okay, we didn't do the vastus medialis or the vastus intermedius because they're a bit harder to measure, and quite frankly, it takes a lot more time. And sometimes the measurement tools that we use can't actually get those muscles as well as the rec fem and the vas lat. So that was the main finding.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we took things a little bit further. we also looked at the individual muscle-specific results as well. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
how do things look for the rectus femoris? How do things look for the vastus lateralis? And this is where it gets a bit interesting, and a lot of this is speculative and needs further research. But there was a slight trend for greater vastus lateralis hypertrophy in the failure protocol. Okay, very slight
Mm-hmm.
trend. We can't be very confident about the direction, the the magnitude of that effect, and how certain we would be to see it in practice. But it was
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless there. And the RIR protocol seemed to induce slightly more hypertrophy of the rectus femoris. And when you think about the differences between those exercises, as you alluded to earlier, the
Mm-hmm.
leg press likely stimulates the vastus lateralis more so than the rectus femoris. On the other hand, the leg extension likely stimulates the rectus femoris a lot more than the vastus lateralis. It seems to me that maybe there is this interaction here between proximity to failure and the order of exercises, and then obviously the subsequent musculature that is targeted by those exercises. So, if on the leg press, the target muscle really is the vastus lateralis, training to failure might maximize hypertrophy in that muscle, but the subsequent fatigue might compromise hypertrophy of the target muscle in the second exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for the RIR protocol, because they went into the leg extension with less fatigue, as evidenced by our fatigue related outcomes, hypertrophy was of the target muscle was sustained. And we see that slight difference there. That was the hypothesis behind those findings. But
Mm-hmm.
again, those findings are quite small in their magnitude, and I really hope further research can build on that and investigate that muscle specific hypertrophy a little bit further.
Yeah, that was an interesting finding. Now, I was also wondering, my understanding is that after a bout of resistance training, you get some muscular swelling that can be picked up by the ultrasound so that it looks like there was more hypertrophy than there actually was. So, how did you, if this limitation exists and I'm not incorrect here, how did you work around it? When did you take the ultrasound measures?
Yeah, that is a limitation, and it does depend on when you take the ultrasound measures, and also how the number of ultrasound measurements you you take. So, for example, in my post testing week, I
Mm-hmm.
took two ultrasound assessments.
Mm-hmm.
I did the same in the pre testing week for a specific reason, which I'll get to. Now, those two ultrasound assessments, they were separated by 48 to 72 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the first ultrasound assessment was a minimum of 72 hours prior to the last training session.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we have that initial ultrasound assessment, and then another one, right, 2 to 3 days later. We
Mm-hmm.
take the average of the two and use that as the data point,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the way I think I've gotten around that limitation, whereby cell swelling may influence the thickness of the muscle measured, is
Mm-hmm.
by taking the two measures and stretching out that measurement period further and further from the final training session. Now, another reason for doing the two pre and post testing ultrasound assessments was to calculate the error margin of my measurements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what that means is that I can report the error margin, and I can say that if the change in muscle thickness exceeded that error margin, we can be more confident that that change is due to hypertrophy of the targeted muscle as opposed to measurement error or randomness
Mm-hmm.
in that measurement. So what I found for both my pre and post testing ultrasound assessments was that the error margin was quite small. And if you look at some of the graphics I provided, the error margin is indicated by a gray shaded area, and you'll notice that the probability distributions, they lie within that area, right, that gray area, which means that we are confident in those changes being due to hypertrophy of the target muscles.
Brilliant. Thank you for explaining that. Now, another interesting measure or another interesting uh, that you collect, piece of data that you collected was related to neuromuscular fatigue. So, could you explain what that is and why you wanted to study it?
So in the past, the idea of neuromuscular fatigue has been investigated using proxy measures.
Mhm,
So, for example, changes in lifting velocity, right, which are found to be quite reliable measures of actual neuromuscular fatigue, and even changes in repetition performed, right, from the
mhm,
first to the final set. That's a very practical measure that we can use in practice. So, we're not really assessing neuromuscular fatigue directly, we're assessing these proxy measures.
mhm,
And in the past, research has done so acutely. So, in 2022, I conducted a study myself looking at the influence of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue, but it was in an acute setting. What I mean by that was right after the training session, 24 hours later, and then 48 hours later as well. So, in the grand
mhm.
scheme of things, quite acute. But
Okay.
of course, we could imagine that if you expose yourself to the same training stimulus week to week,
Mhm,
the level of fatigue consequent to that training stimulus might decrease
mhm,
because your muscles become acclimatized to it. They get better at handling um, energy within the muscle itself.
mhm,
Resynthesizing energy, getting rid of metabolic byproducts. Your brain might even experience neural adaptations that help with that too. So people often speak about this fatigue resistance, right? That might build up over time. And that's something that I wanted to investigate in this study. And I did that by looking at changes in lifting velocity from the first to the final set on the leg press in weeks 1, 4, and 8 of the intervention. So we can
mhm,
compare across those weeks. And when it comes to repetition loss from the first to the final set, I had data from every single session completed, right? And we were able to plot the trend, the change across
mhm,
the 16 sessions or across the 8 weeks. And I don't mind the idea of using these proxy measures of investigating neuromuscular fatigue because they're practical. We can easily transition them into practice. And of course, actually measuring neuromuscular fatigue, again, requires quite sophisticated tools and equipment, which sometimes makes it hard in a research setting. So, what I found across the 8 weeks was that training to failure consistently led to greater decreases in lifting velocity and repetitions performed from the
mhm,
first to the final set. But that was dependent on the exercise performed and the stage of the resistance training intervention. So, if we focus for now on repetition loss, if you look at figure 6, which shows the trend over time, what you'll see is that repetition loss actually increased slightly across the 8 weeks, but
mhm,
more so for RIR than fail. So fail was a little more stable across the 8 weeks. Fail increased repetition loss a little more. So you could say by looking at that, RIR experienced more fatigue
mhm,
across the 8 weeks. But one of the potential reasons as to why we're seeing that is because with RIR, the actual set termination point would really differ across participants to some extent and possibly across weeks too. Now, hopefully, there's not going to be that much variation, but it's possible that in the earlier weeks of the intervention, individuals were more likely to reach a 3 RIR versus a 1 RIR. Whereas in the latter weeks of the intervention, individuals were more likely to reach a 1 RIR versus a 3, right? Whether that was a subconscious pacing strategy that was employed, I'm not exactly sure. And I don't really know if that's exactly why we're seeing those slight differences there in the trend. But
mhm,
when we look at the leg extension, which when you think about it is a more isolated exercise. So really when you're thinking about recovery from a leg extension, right, in between sets, what are you thinking? Well, basically it comes down to how the muscle deals with right energy, right?
mhm,
How fast it can remove metabolic byproducts, resynthesize ATP, maintain calcium flux within the muscle as well. All these things are important for recovery in between sets, and there's less of an external influence, right? So neural fatigue is likely a little bit lower, right? There's more of a stability demand, which is a little bit different on the leg press, which might influence things too. There's less cardiovascular demand as well, which might influence how one recovers in between sets versus the leg press. And what
Mhm.
we see on the leg extension is that for both protocols, repetition loss actually decreased,
Mhm.
right? So we saw a decrease in repetition loss, which is suggestive of lowered neuromuscular fatigue on the leg extension over the 8-week period. And for fail, though, it was still higher across the 8 weeks. So that's what we found there, basically showing that, yes, there does seem to be some fatigue resistance that takes place over, a long-term intervention, but that might depend on the exercise you're performing. And it still seems that training to failure comes with these large decreases in lifting velocity,
Mhm.
which might be pretty damn important for a sporting athlete or a
Mhm.
power athlete or a strength athlete, right? Is it important for someone who trains for hypertrophy? Maybe, maybe not as much though. Depends on what you think are potent drivers of hypertrophy. And when it comes to repetition loss, well, that's influencing the volume that you're
Mhm.
going to accumulate across sets. So how much do you care about volume load, right? That comes down to you as a practitioner to interpret those results and then come to your own practical applications. And
Mhm.
further from that, those differences in repetition loss led to similar volume load between the protocols across the 8 weeks and a similar
Mhm.
repetition volume too. So although we didn't deliberately equalize volume between
Mhm.
protocols, we only equalized set volume, right? So yes, we equalized set volume, we didn't equalize rep volume or volume load. It turned out that the two protocols um, led to the same amount of set of rep volume and volume load across the 8 weeks.
Yeah, as somebody who's purely interested in hypertrophy, and that would be me, when I looked at the results and I was reading through the part about neuromuscular fatigue, to me, what was interesting was that if you all you care about is hypertrophy, even though there seems to be more velocity loss and potential neuromuscular fatigue from training to failure, the hypertrophy outcomes were very similar. So it seems like even with this extra fatigue, you can still
Mm.
achieve a similar amount of hypertrophy if you choose, for personal preference, perhaps, to train to failure most of the time.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, well, thank you very much for explaining that. Now, from my perspective, I am ready to move on to the practical applications, unless there's anything else you want to clarify for the listeners first.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, so what would be the practical applications of this study in your perspective, the most important ones?
Okay, so when it comes to practical applications, as a practitioner or an individual who's trying to make decisions for their own training,
Mm-hmm.
it's important that when you read research findings, right, you maintain that level of intellectual humility that I spoke about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you don't make decisions overnight based on the findings of a given research study. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
maybe you just tinker with your understanding, you make some small changes to your coaching philosophy, your
Mm-hmm.
programming, and you roll with that and you see what results that comes with over time, because you need to be able to diagnose whether or not what you're doing is working. And if studies are coming out on a 2 to 3 to 4 monthly basis and you're making these changes every few months, you're making abrupt changes every few months, how can you possibly diagnose whether the program is working or not? So that's one thing that I'll say. And I think what will help you make decisions, right, as an individual who looks to research
Mm-hmm.
as a means of informing programming, is having a framework in place, right, that you filter the research findings through. So, for example, this is something I've spoken about quite a bit recently. Um, you can have, for example, some initial heuristics that allow you to make some pretty quick decisions about how close to failure a certain exercise should be pushed without really looking at the research. So, Nikias, I'm going to ask you just briefly here. When you look at a list of exercises, right, and you're trying to decide how close to failure each of them should be pushed, what comes to your mind?
So I'm thinking, who am I programming for? Who is the person that I am taking into account here? So that means, are they a general population client? Are they a bodybuilder? Are they a different athlete? How much experience do they have? What kind of injuries might they have? But also, what's the technical skill required to perform the exercise? So how difficult it is? How many muscles it trains at once? And therefore how much fatigue might be incurred, as well as how much stimulus, and how likely it is, how high will be their RIR accuracy prediction, among other aspects. But
I
these would
like
be
it.
the first that come to mind.
I'll give you a pass on that answer.
Oh.
Um, so, independent of that first point you brought up, which
Mm-hmm.
is relevant to the individual characteristics,
Mm-hmm.
all the other points you raise, to me, are just heuristics, right? So mental shortcuts that allow you to decide how close a certain exercise should be pushed. And
Yes.
you're not really referencing any research to make that decision, because there's no research that's going to tell you
Mm-hmm.
if this exercise um, involves a target muscle that is the limiting factor, right? When you get
Mm-hmm.
close to failure, you should push it closer to failure if you're trying to build muscle. No research study is going to offer you that data, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
as someone who trains in the gym and maybe programs for other individuals, having a set of heuristics based on your knowledge, your experience, and your preferences as a coach, right? I might put more stock into one of those heuristics over another, but you might care more so about fatigue than technique. But for me, it might be the other way around, and that's
Mm-hmm.
fine. We have a set of heuristics that we can justify. But if you just use those heuristics, right, you might be leading yourself astray, and that's where you can bring the research into play.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does the research tell us about proximity to failure? Well, it tells us that on average, right, all else being equal, if you push sets closer to failure, you're likely going to experience more hypertrophy. But it
Mm-hmm.
seems that similar hypertrophy can be experienced if you're at around that 1 to 2 RIR point and failure. Okay, so we don't exactly know the exact relationship of that RIR to hypertrophy relationship, but we're starting to get a better understanding. Um, and how does proximity to failure interact with other training variables? Because Nikias,
Mm-hmm.
when you write up a training program, right, you know that you have volume and you have frequency and you have exercise order and you have so many other things that might interact with proximity to failure and
Mm-hmm.
influence the training stimulus, right?
Yeah.
And what does the research say on those training variables? So this is where you can look at the research findings, right? Take down some notes and come up with some rough rules that you abide by. So for example, if you're writing up a high volume program for a client because you think high volume is going to work well for them, they like high volume, then
Mm-hmm.
maybe you don't push every set as close to failure as you otherwise would if you were writing a low volume program,
Mm-hmm.
right? Over time, when new research comes through, you can tinker with your understanding of those variables, right, and improve the way you're programming. But you're using the heuristics and the research, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
taking it further from that. Nikias, I'm sure you work with a lot of clients who have individual characteristics, as you brought
Yeah.
up earlier. So the final layer here, and this goes to show how complicated programming can be, but over time, if you give it enough thought, it becomes easier. So all these things I'm describing now, I can compute in a matter of seconds, right?
Yeah.
I sit down, write a program, and literally all these things are going through my head at any given point in time, and I can make good decisions, or at least what I think are good decisions, pretty quickly, right? And this is
Mm-hmm.
the point of the framework, and it's taken me quite some time to build this framework and to formalize it and to be able to convey it to people, but it works. And you don't have to have the same framework, but if you're trying to interpret research findings, you should at least have something there that helps you filter through them and that takes into account all the other factors we know are important, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is my client's sleep like? What's their nutrition like? What's their stress like at the moment? What's their stress tolerance like? And what are their goals? What is their experience training to failure? Maybe they've trained to failure in the past and they've suffered, and that's an issue. Or maybe they've trained to failure in the past and they've gotten good results. These are
Mm-hmm.
all things that, as a coach, as an individual yourself, if you're training yourself, you're programming for yourself, you should consider these things, right? And it sounds like a lot. It sounds like I'm listing a bunch of things, but in my head, it doesn't look like a list, right? It's a framework. It's structured in a stepwise manner, and that allows me to make good decisions, right? That seem complicated, but in a timely manner when I'm programming for my clients. And it seems that this framework is allowing me to make good decisions that get good results, and so I'm going to hold on to that. And my framework, or at least the end product of that framework, might look a little different to yours, Nikias. But if we're roughly following the same set of principles here, we have a set of heuristics, we've got research findings. These research findings are kind of feeding into our understanding of progressive overload and fatigue management, etc. And we're taking care of the person that we see in front of us, we're probably going to be getting good results, right? And over time, we just tinker with that. So, that's the way I see practical applications, just generally from research, is they should look something like that. Now, in the context of muscle hypertrophy specifically and proximity to failure, clearly we have to be pushing sets close to failure if we're interested in maximizing muscle hypertrophy. And
Mm-hmm.
some of those sets, I think, should be taken to failure. Do all of them need to be taken to failure? Likely not. I think long term, that may come with some downsides, right? If you're programming in a way that accounts for the other training variables and what we know about them. So if you've got a sufficient volume to produce hypertrophy and you've got this certain set of exercises in the program in a certain order, I think
Mm-hmm.
we just have to manage the fatigue that comes along with training to failure. And that doesn't mean we don't include it in a program. It just means we manage it well. So for me, practically what that looks like is, in a given training session, some sets are performed further from failure, others are performed to failure, and that varies week to week across the mesocycle, right? So I consider exercise order. Okay, if someone is doing a really heavy compound movement initially, then I might allow for some reps in the tank there. But with their isolation exercise at the end of the session, if it's working the same target muscle, we're going to push it closer to failure. Okay, if, for example, I have an upper body workout planned, but there's only one shoulder exercise in that upper body workout, maybe that shoulder exercise is pushed to failure or very, very close to it on every set, because there is no real subsequent effect of fatigue on anything else if I'm doing some rows afterwards, or at least it's very minimal compared to if I had 2 or 3 more shoulder exercises to do. So that's my rough thought process. And this is something that comes from the framework that I applied earlier, and it looks different across individuals. I have some clients who train really hard because they sleep very well, they eat very well, they haven't endured an ounce of stress in their lives, and they might be quite young, and so I push them hard. But that looks different across my sample of clients, and I think good coaches know that. I think good coaches know that, they understand that, and they account for some of these things that I'm bringing up. And so there's no right or wrong way, I don't think. If you're making good progress following one approach over another, stick to it and evaluate its long-term effects on your body, your motivation to train, and all the other factors that in practice become very important.
Thank you, Martin. What I take from this study and what you've just discussed is that we have a lot of choice. We know we need to train close to failure. But in the past, there have been debates, or there have been people who strongly thought that we needed to take every single set to failure, otherwise we wouldn't maximize our results. Whereas what these evidence, like the study that you conducted, is starting to suggest is that you can actually adopt a variety of proximity to failure paradigms and get similar results. And what I think is really important to take away is that you also don't need to choose between RIR and failure. As you said, you can easily implement RIR targets for an exercise, take one set to failure on that exercise, or even none. Maybe take a set to failure on a different exercise where the same target muscle is the limiting factor. So basically what I like it personally, but also its advantageous is that if you're interested in hypertrophy, there is a lot of choice, and you don't need to limit yourself by adhering to one particular ideology when it comes to proximity to failure.
I agree. And I think it's important for people to understand that RIR and failure sit on the same side of the fence.
Hmm.
We have an RIR scale, and at the end of that scale sits the maximum endpoint, which is failure,
Hmm.
right? And those two things operate on the same scale together. And if you think about it that way, there is absolutely no need to dichotomize the two.
Hmm.
And I think it's really that simple. And I
Yeah.
hope that research that is published over the coming years continues to showcase that idea, because in the past people would read study conclusions and they'd see that there is no statistically significant difference between failure and non-failure training. They'd say, well, you just don't have to train to failure ever. And I think there's some utility to
Hmm.
training to failure, but utility doesn't mean complete truth, and we have to consider that in our programming. And I hope my study, despite comparing the two, right? Because in research, you just sometimes have to again draw that line and dichotomize certain ideas. I hope that although my study does that to answer a specific question, in practice we can look at the results and reconcile those, reconcile failure with RIR, because I think in practice, like I said, they sit on the same side of the fence.
I agree. Failure to me is the last point on the RIR or RPE scale. Oh, well, on the RPE scale, it's the last
Yeah.
point. On the RIR
Yes.
scale is the
Yeah. Opposite. Yeah.
but Martin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today to discuss your study. Thank you for the study itself. It was a huge amount of work, 3 years of your life. Now, my question is, can we already call you doctor?
No, not yet. I have submitted my thesis, and it is currently being examined, I think, by 3 experts in the field. So I will have my result in the coming months. I believe it takes a few months for the result to come back. And Nikias, maybe the next time I'm on this podcast for whatever reason, you can call me doctor.
Awesome. I look forward to that day. And in the meantime, unless there is anything that you believe you want to leave the listeners with that we haven't touched on, my final question would be, where can people connect with you and find out more about what you do?
I think we covered a lot today. I'm happy to leave it there. I always encourage people to give me feedback and ask questions if they have anything they want to follow up on. The
Hmm.
best place to find me is on Instagram, MR Fitness with a double underscore. I'll be posting, my newly published research on Instagram in the coming months. I do have some things in the works, which I think listeners of this podcast will find interesting. So if you like what I have to say and what I do, be sure to follow me.
Awesome. I will leave your Instagram account in the show notes. And
Right.
thank you again for coming on. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in. And until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast
and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.